In my first job as a nurse practitioner, I was in a residency program where I experienced sexual harassment consistently for about a year.
Early on in my career, I began to notice issues with pay. I kept learning that someone who was new would be making about what I was making.
I spent 10 years at one church, 6 of which I worked for the church, and I was, for most of the time, the only woman on staff. And it was pretty challenging.
Went and applied for the job, and I sat down with the photography director there, and he said, well, what are your aspirations? What kind of things do you want to do? And I said, oh, well, I really want to be a photographer and take pictures. And he said, well, women can't be photographers.
The harasser was both my boss and the director of our residency program, and he would engage in pretty consistent sexualized comments and feeling entitled to touch my body in ways that I'd asked him not to. What is disheartening is that, one, I was in that program with a colleague who was also a resident who asked that we not report it because of concerns for her own career, what would happen if he was not able to give her good recommendations for future jobs. So we kind of stayed in that period for much longer than I wish we would have.
Finally, I gathered my courage. I did my homework, and I compiled numbers and took them into the provost. That would be my boss. And he quickly said, oh no, our HR person is very careful about this issue. There is not an issue.
It felt like an uphill battle often, being the only woman in the office. When I would bring it up, I would just be sort of challenged, what I was saying was irrelevant to the conversation. One time, a coworker mentioned that, oh, if he received a resume from a man and a resume from a woman, he would obviously look at the resume from a man first. And I pointed that out as sexist behavior, and he really dismissed me, saying, that's beside the point, you're getting off track.
My mother had heard through the neighborhood that there was a portrait photographer who needed an assistant. I thought, oh, that sounds like a good way to get some practical experience working with cameras and lights. So I went to interview, and after the interview, as we were wrapping it up, he said, well, I'd love to take your portrait sometime. And I'd seen his portraits around that he had taken of families. And I said, oh, well, sure, that's nice. And he said, oh, but I would like, do you mind taking your shirt off? And so I can photograph you in your bra. And I thought, ooh. I was only 22, but that didn't sound very good to me. And I just thought, I'm getting out of here. I got up and left.